Hi, my name is Lauren. I use she, her pronouns, and today I will be talking about learning the rules, spatial serial reversal learning, and wild food catching chickadees. Learning is something that we are all very familiar with. At its core, it's the ability to learn or make associations between two or more things. But there are multiple types of learning, and one type that I'm particularly interested in is called reversal learning, or the ability to learn and relearn contingencies associated with an initial association. This is also called cognitive flexibility, and a great way of differentiating this from an initial learning is thinking about being assigned a locker, whether it's for high school or in a gym. When you're assigned an initial locker, you must both remember the location and the combination in order to access that space. Now, if you're assigned a new locker, you must now forget or extinguish those previous memories and learn a new space and a new combination associated with that same context. That would be the reversal learning. Now, there's a hypothesized trade-off between associative and reversal learning in which individuals can either be good at one or the other, but not both. And this is really interesting to me because it raises the question of how do these types of learning interact when animals are trying to attempt a more complex task, such as learning a pattern. Now, patterns may use both associative and reversal learning, and there may be several iterative steps that are required in order to learn a pattern. So in this example of a spatial pattern of my two favorite things, coffee and books, in order to learn this, the first thing you've got to do is learn what are the individual components. So learn that the coffee icon and the book icon and what they represent. The next thing to do is to learn what is the repeating unit. So a repeating unit would be, in this case, a coffee and a book, and there might be different rules to learn how this pattern progresses. So you could learn that every other space is filled by coffee and every other space is filled by books, or you can learn that there's exactly one coffee and then one book and that repeats, etc., etc. Now, the third level is learning to use this pattern and predict it and extend the sequence further into the future. So in this case, after the coffee icon, the next one would be a book. And these levels of learning range from simple to complex, and we argue that in order to use the more complex levels, you must first learn the initial levels and learn the associations and the pattern first. I want to explore these three levels of learning and explore whether a food catching bird can use all three levels while learning a complex pattern and how this relates to different environmental conditions. To do this, I will use mountain chickadees. This is a small passerine bird that uses spatial cognition to survive harsh winter conditions. We have a field site in the Sage-Hen Experimental Forest in Northern California. And what's really special about this is that we have a lot of previous work done in this area. We focus our work on two different elevations, one at high elevation and one at low elevation in the Sierra Nevada. And these are only separated by about 500 meters, but are substantially different environments. And so we have previously shown that there are significant cognitive, morphological, and behavioral differences between birds at our high and low elevation site. And we have found that there is selection on spatial cognition at high elevation. Now, to do this, I am going to do a serial reversal, but I'm going to give it a couple of twists to make it more interesting and to make it more adaptable for a natural environment working with wild birds. I will be using this experimental setup. I will call it a feeder array, and each of these 8 boxes represents a different mechanical feeder. This is powered by a battery, and all you really need to know is that each one has a mechanical door that can be programmed to open or close for different birds that land if that bird has a passive integrated transponder PIT tag. And so this means that we can control which birds have access to which feeders. For the experiment, we will teach birds that 2 feeders provide food. This resembles the lab experiments for serial reversal, where either birds can find at feeder 8 or feeder 2, or in this case, it could be any feeder. And it makes it more complicated because there are 6 additional feeders that birds could make errors to. So an error would be if they're supposed to go to feeder 8, but they instead go to feeder 3 before they find their food reward, that would be an error. So in phase 1, birds can make the initial association and learn that feeder 8 provides food. In phase 2, they can learn the first reversal and make the association that there's a new feeder that provides food. And then in phase 3 would be the serial reversal. And this would be where birds have to alternate back and forth. So one day feeder 8 might provide food, and the next day feeder 2 would provide food. The reason we alternate daily is because this allows birds to forage at any point in time during daylight hours. Again, this is in a natural setting. We can't control when birds will arrive at the arrays. And then it also allows for at least 12 hours each night when the feeders are shut down. So that means that at dawn the next day, the feeder assignments will switch. And so the first visit of the day, the birds will have to figure out which feeder is rewarding, and solve the task that way. So some predictions and results. We've already talked about learning the associations, but to assess whether birds are learning the pattern, we would look at their first visits in the first trial per day. Again, this is after the switch, after they've had downtime for 12 hours to figure out, they have to find where the food is going to be. So if the previous reward was number 2 and the next reward was number 8, we would expect that birds would first go to number 2 and then would go to the correct rewarding feeder. So they would probably make the first error, not make that switch, but they would then immediately know where to go next. So in our data, I will show you on the x-axis the number of days of the serial reversal. I will show you on the y-axis the number of location errors per trial. Again, fewer errors means better performance on the task. And I will show you the performance across the first 5 trials. The first thing you should note here is that there is very fast learning going on here. So the huge difference in the number of errors between trial 1 and trials 2 through 5 is very significant and shows that while birds are trying to figure out where the feeder is in that first trial per day, they quickly learn where they're supposed to forage for the rest of it. The other thing that is really noticeable here is that there is a difference between high elevation on the left and low elevation on the right in that first trial per day. And this is significant, and birds at low elevation are learning faster across the 7 days of the experiment. The fact that the total number of errors does decrease does suggest that they are learning the pattern better, and they are potentially learning where they're supposed to go next and learning to predict. Now, in order to have more evidence for learning to predict, we have another prediction of how to assess this. In order for this, if a bird truly perfectly was able to predict and extend out that sequence, we would expect them to go directly to the next reward of that feeder for the next day. In addition to this, we would expect that the probability of them visiting the old feeder at all would be decreasing across the experiment. So if we look at this data, we can see on the x-axis we have the number of days. On the y-axis, we have the probability of making an error to the previous feeder. And we do see that at low elevation, we do see a significant decrease across the days of the experiment. This is only about 20%, but it is significant and does suggest that birds are learning to predict and are less likely to go to that previous feeder. To just reiterate these results, on the left we have the number of errors, on the right we have the probability of visiting the previous trial, and we can see that at low elevation it is decreasing for both, suggesting that birds are both making fewer errors as they are trying to find the correct feeder in the first trial, and they are less likely to visit the previous. This suggests that birds are learning to predict at low elevation. We also found evidence that at both elevations birds were learning the association and learning the pattern, but at low elevation birds were learning it faster than at high elevation. This is a summary of our conclusions. Thank you for listening. Feel free to reach out if you want to hear anything more about this experiment.